Caligula remains one of the most infamous figures in Roman history, often remembered as a tyrant whose reign was marked by madness, cruelty, and excess. His reputation as a monstrous ruler has been cemented in popular imagination through centuries of historical writing, literature, and modern media. Yet, despite this widely accepted portrayal, the reality of his rule is more complex, raising the question of whether Caligula was truly as mad as history has painted him, or if his infamy was shaped by exaggeration, bias, and political defamation. The fascination with Caligula stems largely from his dramatic and short-lived reign. Ascending to the throne in 37 AD after the death of Emperor Tiberius, Caligula was initially hailed as a benevolent and promising ruler, seen as a refreshing contrast to the paranoia and repression of his predecessor. However, his rule quickly descended into chaos, with accounts describing a man who declared himself a god, waged bizarre military campaigns, squandered Rome's wealth, and engaged in acts of extreme cruelty. His assassination in 41 AD, just 4 years into his reign, further cemented the notion that he had become intolerable to those around him. Much of what we know about Caligula comes from ancient historians such as Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio. These sources, however, present challenges in reconstructing an accurate picture of his rule. Suetonius, writing decades later in the 12 Caesars, offers one of the most detailed accounts but indulges heavily in sensationalism, portraying Caligula as a depraved and almost comically insane figure. Tacitus, whose works on Caligula's reign are mostly lost, is known for his critical and often cynical approach to emperors, while Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, presents another version filled with anecdotes that suggest both tyranny and extravagance. Given that many of these sources were written with the benefit of hindsight, under regimes that sought to discredit Caligula, it is likely that their accounts were influenced by political bias. To understand Caligula's reign, it is necessary to consider the state of the Roman Empire before he came to power. His predecessor, Tiberius, ruled for over 2 decades, a period that saw increasing political repression, distrust, and the infamous treason trials that led to the executions of many prominent Romans. Tiberius's withdrawal to the island of Capri in his later years further distanced him from Rome, leaving much of the governance to figures like the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who engaged in ruthless purges of the elite. By the time Tiberius died, Rome was weary of a ruler who had become increasingly paranoid and detached. The arrival of Caligula, the son of the beloved General Germanicus, was met with celebration. He was young, charismatic, and viewed as a restoration of the Julian line, with high expectations placed upon him to undo the damage of his predecessor's later years. The contrast between the early months of Caligula's reign and what followed is striking. Initially, he made popular decisions, including recalling exiles, reducing excessive taxation, and hosting lavish public games to entertain the people. However, a serious illness, possibly an epileptic episode, a neurological disorder, or even poisoning, marked a dramatic shift in his personality and governance. This transformation has led to speculation about whether his subsequent actions were the result of psychological illness, a reaction to the pressures of rule, or simply the exaggerations of hostile sources. Among the many stories attributed to Caligula, some are undoubtedly exaggerated or misinterpreted. The famous claim that he intended to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul, is often cited as proof of his madness. However, modern historians suggest that this may have been a political statement mocking the Senate rather than a literal plan. His alleged military campaign against the ocean, in which he supposedly ordered his soldiers to collect seashells as trophies, is another tale that raises questions. Some interpretations suggest this was a symbolic act or part of a psychological strategy rather than sheer lunacy. His self-deification, another controversial aspect of his rule, was not entirely unprecedented in Rome, as earlier rulers had been honored with divine status after their deaths, and Eastern traditions of ruler worship were not unfamiliar to the empire. While there is little doubt that Caligula was a ruler who wielded power recklessly and indulged in extravagant excess, it is worth considering whether his reputation as a mad emperor was partly shaped by his political enemies. His conflict with the Senate, which resented his autocratic tendencies and dismissal of their influence, likely contributed to the vilification of his name after his death. The Praetorian Guard, which had once supported him, eventually turned against him, highlighting the volatile nature of power in imperial Rome. His assassination was not just the result of personal grievances, but a broader political move to remove a ruler who had alienated too many key figures. The question of whether Caligula was truly mad or merely a victim of historical character assassination remains open to interpretation. His reign was undoubtedly tumultuous, but whether his actions stemmed from genuine insanity, calculated cruelty, or political missteps is a matter of debate. Modern historians, with access to a broader range of sources and psychological analyses, continue to reassess his legacy. He remains a figure who fascinates, not just because of his alleged atrocities, but because he represents the thin line between power and madness in history. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known to history as Caligula, was born on August 31st, 12 AD, into one of Rome's most prominent and revered families. His father, Germanicus, was a celebrated general and a direct descendant of Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, was a granddaughter of Augustus and a formidable political figure in her own right. The young Gaius was thus born into immense privilege, but also into a world fraught with power struggles, political intrigue, and deadly rivalries that would shape his destiny in ways no one could have foreseen. His early years were filled with both adoration and tragedy, and the shadow of his family's rise and fall would haunt him throughout his life. Germanicus was not just a popular military commander. He was widely beloved by the Roman people and the legions alike. His campaigns in Germania secured his reputation as a brilliant strategist, and many Romans saw him as the ideal successor to the aging Emperor Tiberius. However, this popularity made him a potential threat to the ruling regime. In 19 AD, while serving in the East, Germanicus fell mysteriously ill and died. Many believed he had been poisoned on orders from Tiberius or his powerful advisor, Sejanus. Germanicus's death sent shockwaves through Rome. His widow, Agrippina, was convinced of foul play and began openly accusing Tiberius of orchestrating his demise. This put her and her children in a precarious position, as she became a vocal opponent of the emperor. During his early childhood, Gaius was largely protected from these political struggles. He grew up among the Roman military, accompanying his father on campaigns along the Rhine. It was during this time that he acquired the nickname Caligula, meaning little boots, due to the small soldier's sandals, Caligi, he wore as a child. The soldiers adored him, treating him as a sort of mascot, and this early exposure to military life would leave a lasting impression on him. Despite the affectionate nickname, Caligula's childhood was far from idyllic. The death of his father left his family vulnerable, and his mother's relentless pursuit of justice for Germanicus would ultimately lead to her downfall. Agrippina the Elder's bold defiance of Tiberius and Sejanus put her at odds with the imperial administration. She was eventually arrested, exiled, and starved to death on the orders of Tiberius. Her sons, Nero and Drusus, were also targeted and ultimately perished under mysterious circumstances. This left Caligula as one of the last surviving members of Germanicus's direct line, a precarious position in a court where rivals and enemies lurked at every turn. By his teenage years, Caligula had been removed from his mother's care and sent to live under the watchful eye of Tiberius himself. The emperor, having withdrawn from public life, resided on the island of Capri, where he ruled through fear and intimidation. It was here that Caligula spent much of his adolescence, learning to navigate the dangerous world of Roman politics. He was forced to suppress any resentment he might have felt toward Tiberius, instead adopting an attitude of compliance and adaptability. The island of Capri was infamous for its debauchery, cruelty, and paranoia. Tiberius had grown increasingly distrustful of those around him, and his court was filled with spies and informers. Executions were frequent, and whispers of conspiracy could lead to immediate death. Caligula, despite being the son of Germanicus, was not exempt from suspicion. However, he displayed a remarkable ability to survive in this treacherous environment. He played the role of the dutiful ward, never outwardly challenging Tiberius, and maintaining an air of loyalty even as his mother and brothers perished. His ability to hide his true feelings and adapt to the volatile climate of the imperial court demonstrated a keen political instinct that would later define his reign. Despite the grim atmosphere of Capri, Caligula was not entirely without allies. His grandmother, Antonia Minor, the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia, Augustus's sister, maintained some influence at court and likely worked to protect him. Additionally, he formed a connection with Naevius Suetonius Macro, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, who would later play a crucial role in his rise to power. Throughout his years under Tiberius, Caligula lived in a paradoxical state. He was both a potential heir to the empire and a prisoner of its ruling elite. He was surrounded by excess and cruelty, yet he himself remained outwardly composed, careful never to show defiance or ambition. His survival depended on his ability to mask his true thoughts and play the role expected of him. It is likely that this period deeply shaped his later actions as emperor. Having witnessed firsthand the paranoia and brutality of Tiberius's rule, he would have understood the precarious nature of absolute power. In 37 AD, Tiberius died, reportedly either of natural causes or smothered by Macro to ensure a smooth succession. With his passing, Caligula emerged as the new emperor, a young man who had survived the brutal intrigues of the imperial court but had been profoundly affected by them. He was welcomed as a liberator, a fresh start after the dark years of Tiberius's rule. The people of Rome, remembering Germanicus's legacy, rejoiced at his accession, believing that the son of their beloved general would restore prosperity and justice. However, the Caligula who took the throne was not the innocent, promising youth they had envisioned. His childhood had been defined by loss, betrayal, and the ever-present threat of death. He had learned that power was maintained through fear, and that loyalty was often an illusion. These lessons would soon become evident in the way he governed. Tiberius spent his final years increasingly isolated, consumed by paranoia and suspicion. His rule had become synonymous with fear, as he relied heavily on treason trials to eliminate perceived threats. Many senators and members of the imperial family fell victim to his purges, leaving Rome in a state of unease. By 37 AD, Tiberius had largely withdrawn from direct governance, delegating much of his power to his Praetorian prefect, Naevius Suetonius Macro. While Tiberius was still the emperor in name, his influence had waned, and the question of succession loomed large. Caligula, the surviving son of Germanicus, was the most popular candidate, but there were those who feared what his rule might bring. Macro, understanding the shifting tides of power, positioned himself as a key player in Caligula's rise. As head of the Praetorian Guard, he wielded significant military influence, and his support was essential for any transition of power. Tiberius had reportedly named both Caligula and his own grandson, Tiberius Gemellus, as joint heirs, though this decision was met with skepticism. Many suspected that Tiberius had no real intention of allowing an easy transfer of power, and that he had left room for maneuvering even in his final moments. His death in March 37 AD was clouded in suspicion. Some accounts suggest he died of natural causes, succumbing to old age, while others claim Macro smothered him with a pillow to ensure Caligula's uncontested rule. Whether or not Macro directly assassinated the aging emperor, the Praetorian prefect swiftly acted to eliminate any obstacles to Caligula's ascension. With Tiberius dead, the transition of power proceeded rapidly. The Senate, weary of Tiberius's oppressive rule, eagerly endorsed Caligula as the new emperor. The Roman public, too, received the news with joy. As the son of Germanicus, Caligula was seen as a rightful heir, someone who could restore the glory of the Julian line. The celebrations were widespread, and the new emperor was hailed as a savior. His youth and charisma further enhanced his appeal, and for the first time in years, Rome felt optimistic about its leadership. Caligula's early reign was marked by decisions that reinforced this initial goodwill. He presented himself as a ruler dedicated to reversing the perceived injustices of Tiberius's rule. One of his first acts was restoring senatorial authority, granting the Senate more freedom in decision-making, and symbolically ending the reign of fear that had defined the previous administration. He repealed some of Tiberius's harshest policies, including the treason trials that had claimed the lives of many prominent Romans. This move reassured the elite that Caligula would not continue the oppressive tendencies of his predecessor. Financial relief was another significant aspect of his early rule. Recognizing the economic strain that Tiberius's tax policies had placed on the population, Caligula enacted measures to ease the financial burden. He provided generous public donations and reduced some of the heavier taxes. This move was immensely popular, especially among the lower classes, who had suffered under the weight of imperial taxation. The emperor also organized lavish public games and festivals, further solidifying his reputation as a ruler who cared for the people. These spectacles were designed not only for entertainment, but also to demonstrate the emperor's generosity and ability to provide for his subjects. The events were grander than any seen in years, featuring gladiatorial contests, theatrical performances, and large-scale feasts. Another early priority for Caligula was repatriating exiles. Many individuals who had been banished under Tiberius's rule were welcomed back to Rome, further reinforcing the perception that a new era of justice and fairness had begun. He also took great care to honor the legacy of his father, Germanicus. Statues and commemorations of Germanicus were restored, and Caligula frequently invoked his father's name in public speeches, reminding Rome of his lineage and the legitimacy of his rule. These acts endeared him to the populace, who still held Germanicus in high regard. One of the more intriguing aspects of Caligula's reign was his relationship with his sisters, particularly Drusilla. Unlike previous emperors, who kept their female relatives in the background of political affairs, Caligula openly promoted his sisters as key figures in the imperial court. Drusilla, in particular, was given exceptional status, and the emperor's closeness to her sparked rumors of an incestuous relationship. While there is little concrete evidence to support these claims, the political significance of his sisters cannot be overlooked. By elevating them, Caligula sought to create a dynastic image, one that emphasized the Julian bloodline. He even introduced coins featuring his sisters, an unprecedented move that further integrated them into the state's iconography. Drusilla was not merely a symbolic figure. She wielded considerable influence within the imperial court. Her presence by Caligula's side signaled continuity and stability, reinforcing the idea that the emperor's rule was divinely sanctioned. However, her death in 38 AD would mark a turning point in Caligula's reign. Her passing deeply affected him, and from that moment, his behavior became increasingly erratic. Whether her death led to psychological instability or merely coincided with an already shifting political landscape remains a matter of debate. Caligula's initial reign suggested that he had the potential to be a competent and popular ruler. He had the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, the adoration of the people, and the support of the Senate, at least initially. However, underlying tensions remained. The Senate, though temporarily placated, still harbored suspicions about the young emperor's long-term intentions. The military, while loyal, had yet to see how he would lead in times of crisis. And within the imperial court, rival factions continued to maneuver for influence. The optimism that surrounded the beginning of Caligula's reign would soon give way to a much darker reality, as the emperor's policies and personal behavior began to shift dramatically. Caligula's reign took a dramatic and terrifying turn in late 37 AD, mere months after he had been hailed as Rome's new golden ruler. Initially celebrated for his generosity, justice, and reforms, his behavior underwent a striking transformation following a severe illness. Historians remain divided on the nature of this illness. Some suggest it was a natural disease, perhaps an extreme fever or poisoning, while others propose it was a mental breakdown triggered by years of psychological trauma. Regardless of the cause, his recovery was accompanied by an alarming shift in temperament. Where there had been benevolence, now there was cruelty. Where once he had sought harmony with the Senate and people, he now viewed them with suspicion and contempt. The sudden deterioration of his health in 37 AD nearly claimed his life. Ancient sources, such as Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe an illness that left him bedridden for weeks, and many Romans feared he would not survive. His supporters anxiously prayed for his recovery, while some in the Senate and military factions may have secretly hoped for his demise to avoid the growing power of his rule. When he finally emerged from his sickness, something had changed. His actions grew erratic, his generosity faded, and his rule became marked by cruelty and excess. Whether this transformation was caused by lasting neurological effects of the illness, mental instability, or simply the realization that he now had unchecked power is a matter of historical debate. Another blow struck Caligula when his beloved sister, Drusilla, died in 38 AD. Drusilla had been one of his closest confidants, and her loss devastated him. The rumors of incest between the siblings, though unconfirmed, were widespread, and her death only fueled speculation about the true nature of their relationship. In his grief, Caligula took unprecedented steps to elevate Drusilla's memory, deifying her as a divine figure. She was officially declared a goddess, and temples and altars were erected in her honor. No emperor before him had deified a living family member in such a way, and this act set a precedent for his later self-glorification. His obsession with her memory further deepened his eccentricity, and some believe that Drusilla's death contributed to his descent into madness. As his reign progressed, Caligula's sense of absolute power intensified, and with it, his extravagant and autocratic tendencies. One of the most notable aspects of his rule was his reckless spending. Upon taking the throne, he had inherited a vast treasury left by Tiberius, but within a few short years, he had depleted it through lavish construction projects, extravagant games, and personal indulgences. He commissioned grand temples and palaces, including a massive floating palace ship designed for luxury and excess. His love for the extravagant was not limited to architecture. He also spent vast sums on gladiatorial games, chariot races, and theatrical performances meant to showcase his generosity and divine status. However, this extravagance came at a cost. As funds dwindled, Caligula turned to increasingly oppressive methods to refill the treasury. Heavy taxation was imposed on the provinces. Senators were forced to make massive gifts to the emperor, and in some cases, wealthy individuals were accused of crimes so their estates could be seized. This blatant financial exploitation caused widespread resentment, particularly among the aristocracy, who had once viewed him as a promising young leader but now saw him as a tyrant bleeding Rome dry. Among Caligula's most controversial actions was his declaration of divinity. While Roman emperors had previously been honored as divine after their deaths, Caligula was the first to demand to be worshipped as a living god. He ordered temples to be built in his name, had statues of himself erected in sacred places, and even attempted to place his likeness in the Temple of Jerusalem, an act that deeply offended the Jewish population. His insistence on being worshipped led to the appointment of priests dedicated to his cult, and citizens were expected to make sacrifices in his honor. This self-deification was a shocking break from tradition and alienated many in the Senate, who viewed it as the ultimate sign of megalomania. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, reinforcing the image of a ruler detached from reality. He frequently dressed as various gods, including Jupiter and Neptune, wearing divine regalia and speaking in a manner that suggested he genuinely believed himself to be above mortal men. He was also said to have spoken to the moon, claiming to have private conversations with the celestial body. His fascination with divine imagery extended into his interactions with the Senate and the Roman elite. On multiple occasions, he humiliated senators by forcing them to worship him or partake in ridiculous ceremonies designed to reinforce his superiority. As paranoia set in, Caligula's reign became increasingly bloodthirsty. He saw potential threats everywhere and took preemptive measures to eliminate them. Senators, nobles, and even close advisors were executed on the slightest suspicion of disloyalty. The purges began with former allies, men who had helped him rise to power, such as Noevius Sutorius Macro, the Praetorian prefect who had ensured his succession. Even members of his own family were not spared. He exiled or executed relatives who he believed posed a threat to his rule. Caligula's purges were carried out with a sense of theatrical cruelty. He relished humiliating his victims before their executions, often inviting them to banquets where they would be suddenly arrested or even forced to take their own lives in front of the assembled guests. These acts of terror served to instill fear in Rome's elite, ensuring that no one dared to oppose him openly. His unchecked power, combined with his extravagance and erratic behavior, turned the Roman political landscape into a battlefield of fear and survival. By the time Caligula had fully embraced his tyrannical rule, Rome had changed. The Senate, once a respected governing body, had been reduced to a group of terrified men who obeyed his every whim. The treasury was drained, and the people, once enamored by his charisma, had begun to grow wary of his excesses. The initial enthusiasm that had greeted his ascension to power had long since faded, replaced by a mixture of fear, resentment, and silent opposition. His descent into tyranny was complete, and the consequences of his rule would soon reach their inevitable conclusion. Caligula's military campaigns were among the most bewildering and controversial aspects of his reign. Despite his grand ambitions of military conquest, his actual campaigns were marked by strange behavior, missed opportunities, and a series of bizarre decisions that left Rome questioning his competence as a leader. His approach to warfare often seemed more theatrical than strategic, and his campaigns in Germania and Britain became legendary not for their victories, but for their absurdity. One of the key military endeavors during Caligula's reign was his supposed invasion of Germania. Given his father Germanicus's legacy as a brilliant commander in the region, there were expectations that Caligula would follow in his footsteps and achieve great military success. However, his actions in Germania did not live up to these expectations. He made grand proclamations about leading a significant military campaign against the Germanic tribes, but instead of pressing forward with a full-scale invasion, he engaged in strange and humiliating behaviors that baffled his own troops. His leadership style in the campaign was erratic. At times, he issued severe punishments to his soldiers for minor infractions, enforcing discipline in an excessively harsh manner. He often humiliated his men in ways that eroded morale, and his unpredictable decisions caused confusion among the ranks. Instead of focusing on securing victories or expanding Rome's territory, he seemed more interested in performing a theatrical version of a military campaign, where the appearance of power mattered more than actual success on the battlefield. One of the most infamous moments of his Germanic campaign involved a supposed victory that resulted in no real territorial gains. According to ancient sources, Caligula declared triumph over the enemy without actually engaging in any meaningful battles. He then ordered his troops to collect seashells along the shores of the North Sea, claiming them as the spoils of war. This act has puzzled historians for centuries. Some believe it was a symbolic gesture meant to represent Rome's dominance over the ocean, while others see it as evidence of his growing detachment from reality. Regardless of the interpretation, it was clear that his military campaigns were not producing the kind of results Rome had expected from an emperor. His actions in Germania were not the only questionable military moves he made. His approach to the invasion of Britain was equally bizarre. Britain had long been a target for Roman expansion, and a successful campaign there would have been a significant achievement. Caligula made extensive preparations for what seemed to be an ambitious invasion, mobilizing troops and organizing supply lines. However, when the moment came to launch the attack, his actions defied logic. Rather than leading his forces into battle against the British tribes, Caligula reportedly ordered his soldiers to attack the ocean itself. He commanded them to march to the shores, draw their weapons, and strike at the waves as if they were fighting a real enemy. This spectacle left his troops utterly confused, as they had expected to face an actual military campaign rather than an elaborate display of power. After this, he instructed them to gather seashells and carry them back to Rome as trophies, much like he had done in Germania. This act, which he called a victory over Neptune, the god of the sea, reinforced the growing perception that his grasp on reality was slipping. Theories about his behavior during these campaigns vary. Some historians argue that these bizarre military actions were the result of sheer madness, evidence of an emperor completely disconnected from the practicalities of governance and warfare. Others suggest that his actions were part of a larger psychological strategy, a way to instill fear and loyalty in his troops through unpredictable and theatrical displays of power. Another theory posits that he never intended to invade Britain at all, but merely staged an elaborate ruse to justify his triumph in Rome without risking an actual military conflict. Whatever the motivation behind these strange campaigns, their political consequences were severe. His military failures weakened Rome's confidence in his leadership, and his generals and soldiers grew increasingly disillusioned. The Senate, already wary of his erratic behavior, saw his inability to lead successful military campaigns as further proof that he was unfit to rule. Rome prided itself on military strength, and an emperor who failed in war risked losing the support of both the military and the political elite. Caligula's inability to secure real military victories contributed to the growing opposition against him. While he had once been a popular and promising young ruler, his bizarre decisions and humiliating campaigns damaged his reputation beyond repair. His failure to expand the empire, combined with his extravagant spending and growing paranoia, set the stage for the eventual conspiracy that would lead to his assassination. In the end, Caligula's military campaigns were not remembered for their conquests or strategic brilliance, but for their absurdity and symbolic excess. His attempts to emulate his father's military successes fell far short, and his actions only deepened the perception that he was a ruler driven more by spectacle than by genuine military or political acumen. Caligula's reign, once filled with promise and popular support, descended into chaos as his actions became increasingly erratic and tyrannical. His relationship with the Senate, nobility, and common people deteriorated, and his personal scandals only further fueled resentment against him. What had begun as a rule marked by public generosity and grand spectacles soon turned into a nightmare of oppression, extravagance, and paranoia. His treatment of Rome's elite, combined with his growing detachment from reality, ensured that his downfall was inevitable. His interactions with the Senate and the nobility were particularly troubling. While previous emperors had maintained a degree of respect for Rome's governing class, Caligula relished humiliating senators. He made them run beside his chariot like slaves, reducing their dignity before the public. This was not just an assertion of power. It was a deliberate act of degradation. By forcing the highest-ranking men in Rome to behave like common servants, he shattered the illusion of senatorial authority and made it clear that he alone controlled Rome's fate. Beyond humiliations, Caligula went further in his attacks on the aristocracy. He ordered the wives of prominent senators into prostitution, setting up a state-run brothel in the imperial palace to generate revenue for his lavish spending. This was not only an affront to Rome's moral and social order, but also a sign of his complete disregard for the dignity of the ruling class. He treated the nobility as his playthings, subjecting them to personal and financial ruin whenever he pleased. Seizing noble property became another way to fund his extravagances. Estates and wealth were confiscated at will, often under the pretext of fabricated charges of treason. Mass executions became common, as Caligula saw threats in every corner. Those who displeased him, whether politically or personally, could expect sudden death. Rome's most distinguished families lived in a state of constant fear, knowing that their status and influence provided no protection from the emperor's wrath. Despite his alienation of the Senate and nobility, Caligula initially retained some support from the lower classes. His extravagant public games and distributions of money kept the common people entertained and content for a time. However, As the spending spiraled out of control, he resorted to increasing taxation to sustain his opulence. New and oppressive taxes were introduced, affecting both the aristocracy and the general populace. Once celebrated for his generosity, he soon became resented for his economic mismanagement. His cruelty extended beyond the ruling elite and reached the broader population through the bloodthirsty spectacles he hosted. The gladiatorial games, already violent under previous emperors, became even more brutal under his rule. He delighted in watching suffering, sometimes ordering executions for his personal amusement. In one particularly infamous instance, he reportedly forced spectators who arrived late to the games into the arena to be torn apart by wild animals. These public displays of cruelty were meant to instill fear, but they also revealed his deepening disregard for human life. His personal life was no less scandalous. His marriages were impulsive and short-lived, marked by abrupt changes of heart and whims of desire. He married and discarded women with little concern for tradition or stability. His most infamous relationship was with his sister Drusilla. Ancient sources, particularly Suetonius and Cassius Dio, claim that Caligula engaged in an incestuous affair with her, treating her as if she were his wife. Whether these accounts were exaggerated or not, his relationship with Drusilla was undeniably unusual, and her death devastated him. He mourned her as though she had been a divine figure, elevating her to goddess status and demanding that she be worshipped. Beyond his personal scandals, his erratic behavior extended to his plans for succession. Perhaps the most infamous of these stories is his supposed intention to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul of Rome. While this may have been an exaggeration by his detractors, it symbolized the level of absurdity his rule had reached. Whether as a joke, a deliberate mockery of the Senate, or a genuine belief that his horse was more competent than Rome's politicians, the story reinforced the image of Caligula as a ruler who had lost all sense of governance. By the time his reign neared its end, he had alienated nearly every power group in Rome. The Senate despised him for his humiliations and purges, the military grew tired of his pointless campaigns, and the people, once his supporters, suffered under heavy taxation and economic instability. His paranoia and cruelty left few willing to defend him, making his assassination inevitable. What had begun as a reign of hope and celebration had collapsed into a nightmare of excess, madness, and bloodshed. Caligula's reign, marked by extravagance, cruelty, and erratic behavior, inevitably led to his downfall. His increasingly autocratic rule alienated the Senate, nobility, military, and even his own guards. The Praetorian Guard, once responsible for his protection, became the very force that orchestrated his demise. The conspiracy against him was not a spontaneous act, but the result of growing resentment within the empire's power structures. Among those most discontented was Cassius Chaerea, a senior officer of the Praetorian Guard. Caligula had subjected him to repeated public humiliation, often mocking his voice and questioning his masculinity. These personal insults, combined with the emperor's reckless rule, turned Chaerea into a key conspirator. Along with other guards and political figures, he carefully planned the assassination, ensuring that it would not just eliminate Caligula, but also remove the possibility of a loyalist. In the days leading up to his assassination, various omens were said to have warned of his impending doom. Ancient sources, including Suetonius and Cassius Dio, describe strange occurrences, prophetic dreams, unusual animal behavior, and warnings from soothsayers. However, Caligula, in his arrogance, ignored these signs. His sense of invincibility, reinforced by his self-declared divinity, made him blind to the dangers lurking within his own ranks. The attack took place on January 24th, 41 AD, in the heart of Rome. As Caligula made his way through a passageway near the Palatine Games, he was suddenly set upon by his own guards. Cassius Chaerea was among the first to strike, reportedly yelling insults as he drove his blade into the emperor. Others joined in, stabbing Caligula multiple times in a brutal frenzy. The assassination was swift and merciless, a reflection of the hatred he had inspired among his own men. His once mighty rule ended not on a battlefield or in the Senate, but in a bloody betrayal by those meant to protect him. The violence did not end with Caligula's death. His family was next. His wife, Caesonia, and their young daughter were hunted down and executed to prevent any claim to the throne. The child, still an infant, was reportedly killed in an especially brutal manner, a testament to the conspirators' desire to wipe out Caligula's lineage entirely. In the immediate aftermath, Rome was thrown into chaos. The Senate, eager to restore power to itself, moved quickly to erase Caligula's memory. His statues were torn down, his decrees annulled, and discussions of his reign suppressed. The goal was clear: to condemn him to damnatio memoriae, the Roman practice of erasing a person's existence from official history. However, the empire could not remain leaderless for long. While the Senate debated restoring the Republic, the Praetorian Guard had other plans. In a dramatic twist, they found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, hiding behind a curtain in the imperial palace. Though initially considered weak and unlikely to rule, Claudius was declared emperor by the very guards who had slain his predecessor. This moment solidified the power of the Praetorian Guard in choosing emperors and ensured that Rome remained an imperial state rather than reverting to a republic. Despite efforts to erase Caligula's memory, he was never truly forgotten. His reign became a cautionary tale, a symbol of absolute power gone mad. Later accounts painted him as the epitome of a tyrant, ruthless, extravagant, and deranged. Whether or not every story about him was true, his legacy endured, ensuring that for centuries to come, Caligula's name would be synonymous with unchecked despotism and the dangers of imperial excess. The legacy of Caligula remains one of the most controversial in Roman history. His reign, though short, left a lasting impression on both ancient and modern minds. Whether he was a truly mad tyrant or simply the victim of exaggerated accounts is a question that continues to spark debate. The way he has been portrayed throughout history has been shaped largely by the writings of ancient historians, psychological interpretations, and pop culture depictions. The primary sources that document Caligula's life and rule come from historians such as Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio. Suetonius, writing about a century after Caligula's death, paints a picture of a ruler who descended into madness, indulging in extreme cruelty, bizarre extravagances, and erratic behavior. His work, The 12 Caesars, is filled with sensational stories, such as Caligula declaring himself a god, making his horse a consul, and engaging in incestuous relationships with his sisters. However, Suetonius was writing for an audience that enjoyed scandalous tales, and his accounts may have been influenced by the biases of the time. Tacitus, another Roman historian, was highly critical of emperors in general, particularly those he saw as undermining the Senate. While his accounts of Caligula are not as detailed as those of Suetonius, he shares a similar view of the emperor as a despot whose reign was marked by tyranny and cruelty. Cassius Dio, a later historian, also depicted Caligula as a lunatic who ruled through terror. However, all these sources were written long after Caligula's death and were shaped by the political climate of their own times. The loss of contemporary accounts means that much of what we know about Caligula is filtered through the perspectives of later historians, many of whom had reasons to vilify him. Modern historians have attempted to reassess Caligula's reign by considering alternative explanations for his behavior. Some argue that his actions were not signs of insanity, but rather calculated displays of power designed to intimidate his political enemies. Others suggest that his erratic behavior may have been influenced by medical conditions. One theory is that Caligula suffered from epilepsy, which could explain sudden mood swings and violent outbursts. Another possibility is lead poisoning, as Roman water systems contained high levels of lead, which could cause neurological damage over time. Additionally, Caligula's traumatic childhood, marked by the murder of his family members and years spent under Tiberius's paranoia-fueled rule, may have contributed to psychological instability. The impact of absolute power on human psychology is also an important consideration. Studies of modern dictators show that unchecked authority often leads to delusional behavior, paranoia, and cruelty. Caligula, who was worshipped as a god and had no institutional limits on his power, may have fallen victim to the same psychological effects seen in later autocrats. His eccentricities, rather than being purely the result of madness, could have been a deliberate attempt to reinforce his authority in a system where power was constantly under threat. Beyond historical analysis, Caligula's image has been shaped by popular culture. From films to television shows, he is often portrayed as the ultimate mad emperor, indulging in hedonistic excess and cruelty. Perhaps the most infamous depiction is the 1979 film Caligula, which sensationalized his reign with graphic violence and debauchery. Such portrayals have cemented the idea of Caligula as a depraved ruler, even though modern historians tend to view him with more nuance. Despite efforts to reassess his legacy, Caligula remains one of the most infamous figures in Roman history. His name is synonymous with tyranny, madness, and absolute power gone wrong. Whether he was truly insane or simply a victim of biased accounts, his reign serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority. Over time, the debate about Caligula will likely continue, as historians seek to separate fact from fiction in the story of one of Rome's most controversial. Caligula's life and reign remain some of the most debated aspects of Roman history. His rule, spanning just under 4 years, 37 to 41 AD, was marked by an initial period of promise, followed by a dramatic descent into what ancient sources describe as tyranny, extravagance, and madness. His assassination at the hands of his own Praetorian Guard stands as one of the most infamous moments in the history of the Roman Empire, and his legacy has continued to captivate scholars, historians, and the public for centuries. However, the challenge of separating myth from reality makes assessing Caligula's true character a difficult task. Born as Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus in 12 AD, Caligula was the son of the widely admired General Germanicus and the politically ambitious Agrippina the Elder. His early life was shaped by both privilege and tragedy. He spent part of his childhood in military camps, earning the affectionate nickname Caligula from the soldiers, but he also witnessed the downfall of his family due to political intrigues under Emperor Tiberius. The death of his father, possibly by poisoning, and the exile and destruction of his mother and brothers left Caligula in a precarious position, forcing him to navigate the dangerous waters of Roman politics from a young age. His time on the island of Capri with Tiberius exposed him to the paranoia and cruelty of imperial rule, an experience that may have had a profound impact on his own governing style later in life. When Tiberius died in 37 AD, Caligula was hailed as a breath of fresh air. The Senate and the Roman populace initially welcomed his reign with enthusiasm, seeing him as the rightful heir to the legacy of Germanicus. His first months as emperor were marked by gestures of goodwill. He repealed unpopular taxes, restored exiles, honored his family, and provided lavish public entertainment. Rome, weary of Tiberius's repressive rule, rejoiced at the apparent return of a charismatic and benevolent ruler. However, the optimism did not last long. A turning point in Caligula's rule came when he fell gravely ill later in 37 AD. Whether this was due to poisoning, an infection, or a neurological disorder remains unknown, but ancient sources suggest that he was never the same after his recovery. Many accounts claim that he emerged from his illness as a different man, paranoid, erratic, and cruel. It was after this period that he began executing rivals, spending extravagantly, and demanding divine honors. His behavior became increasingly eccentric. He built lavish palaces, squandered Rome's wealth on grandiose projects, and engaged in bizarre acts of humiliation toward the Senate and nobility. His self-declaration as a living god, his insistence on being worshipped, and the supposed appointment of his horse as consul have all become legendary elements of his reign, though it remains uncertain whether these stories are fully accurate or exaggerated by later sources. Caligula's military campaigns added another layer of controversy to his rule. His supposed invasion of Germania ended in an anticlimactic retreat, and his alleged conquest of Britain amounted to nothing more than ordering his troops to collect seashells. Whether these actions were the result of genuine insanity, elaborate psychological tactics, or mere propaganda failures remains a subject of debate. Nevertheless, these episodes contributed to the perception of him as a reckless and irrational ruler. As tensions escalated between Caligula and Rome's elite, his downfall became inevitable. His increasing cruelty, along with his humiliations of the Senate and the Praetorian Guard, led to a conspiracy against him. On January 24, 41 AD, members of his own guard, led by Cassius Chaerea, assassinated him in a brutal attack. His wife and infant daughter were also killed in the aftermath, and the Senate attempted to erase his memory from Roman history. However, the Praetorian Guard quickly elevated his uncle, Claudius, to the throne, ensuring that the imperial system remained intact. The challenge in evaluating Caligula's reign lies in the reliability of historical sources. Most accounts were written decades after his death by authors with clear biases against him. Suetonius, Tacitus, and Cassius Dio, the main sources of his biography, all belong to a senatorial class that resented imperial authority. Their works are filled with sensationalized stories, many of which seem designed to portray Caligula as a monster rather than a complex political figure. The possibility that Caligula was a victim of character assassination by his enemies cannot be ignored. Modern historians have attempted to reassess his legacy with more nuance. Some argue that his actions, though extreme, were not necessarily signs of madness, but calculated demonstrations of power. Others explore psychological and medical explanations, such as the effects of epilepsy, lead poisoning, or post-traumatic stress from his early experiences. Additionally, the nature of absolute power itself may have played a role in shaping his behavior. Without checks on his authority, Caligula may have developed delusions of grandeur and paranoia similar to those seen in many historical autocrats. The fascination with Caligula extends beyond historical studies into popular culture. He has been portrayed in countless films, novels, and television series, usually as the archetype of the insane, debauched ruler. The 1979 film Caligula took this portrayal to an extreme, reinforcing the image of him as a depraved tyrant. However, such depictions often rely on the most lurid and exaggerated aspects of his reputation rather than presenting a balanced view of his reign. Ultimately, the question remains, was Caligula truly a mad tyrant, or was he a misunderstood victim of propaganda? The truth likely lies somewhere in between. While he undoubtedly engaged in excesses and acts of cruelty, the extent of his madness and the motivations behind his behavior are still open to interpretation. His reign serves as a case study in the dangers of absolute power, the fragility of leadership, and the ways in which history is shaped by those who write it. Regardless of whether he was a villain or an exaggerated caricature, Caligula's legacy endures as one of the most infamous in Roman history. His rule, though brief, left an impact that has lasted for centuries, ensuring that his name remains synonymous with the perils of unchecked authority and the fine line